Well, what a day of delicious intellectual connected synergy and content. I want to repeat thanks to Jerry Lenfest, to Buffy Kafritz, to Leonard Silverstein, to the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, but maybe most particularly to Ambassador Arro for hosting us here, and to the French American Cultural Foundation, our co-organizers and my dear cohort in crime, Louise Oliver. It's been really a joy. My task, it seems, is to try to simply offer some connections between today, and fortunately, our speakers made it really wonderfully easy. But just a few takeaways from each of these great moments with these experts. His Excellency Ambassador Arro reminded us that this was really the second 100 Years' War. Boy, that reframes a global conflict. And that France is, in fact, the United States' oldest and closest ally. The French had other reasons, of course, for entering the war for American independence, maybe most prominently revenge and the rebalance of power. He also pointed out that the best outcome of any of the participants came to us. So the weakest, most fragile participant emerged as the greatest beneficiary. He also, and then let me turn to Alan Taylor for his exquisite and succinct description of the American Revolution. I loved his phrase that the US was born with robust ambitions, perhaps unrealistic at the time, given our flagging forces, our lack of resources, starving troops, a weak agricultural economy, a total lack of industrial infrastructure, engineering, and perhaps worst of all, no money. How is it even possible that Americans could have moved forward with such lack of resources, and yet we had those ambitions, and we still do today? At the nadir of the war, 1781, when things looked their bleakest, it was, in fact, Admiral de Grasse and the French Navy who came to our aid. But even that, which seems like the knight in shining armor has arrived and how great Americans are saved, he pointed out this was a really ambitious strategy, without cell phones, without computers, without emails, to try to navigate the coming together of these great forces together at exactly the right time. He reminded us that de Grasse put the entire French holdings of the West Indies at risk to do this, and that there was a closing window, that de Grasse couldn't wait around long. Clearly, I think we've all taken away from this conference that French assistance was critical to our victory. Bertrand Rodot took us through the annals and secret rooms of Versailles and the French court in wonderful ways, revealing for us the texture, the intrigue, and painting for us that incredible picture of the bon sauvage, Franklin. I would posit that Franklin, for all that he has received encomiums, and they are all worthy, also knew a bit about branding and marketing the new American image. Witness Monsieur Rondeau's comments on his influence on fashion. We see, I think, firsthand through Monsieur Rondeau's comments the dramas and challenges for the American envoys who were not. In fact, there were jealousies amongst them, Franklin being the most resented, perhaps, for his fame. And then we went to lunch and had, I think, that wonderful rapid-fire panel of questions we've all wanted to ask about the American Revolution. I found it intriguing that Gordon Wood immediately asserted that Americans were ready for independence as early as 1765. And don't forget that Monsieur Rondeau told us that in 1768, the King of France had sent an envoy, sort of a listening mission, and concluded that there was a spirit of independence in America. So by the 1760s, the pot is beginning to percolate, or shall we say, beginning to come to a low boil. I love the moment when David Rubenstein pointed out that amongst 1.5 million men in America were produced John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and James Madison. And the rest, of course, I think you take away today with 350 million citizens in our country who have yet to provide their equal. They also, of course, made that wonderful comparison of the American War of Independence was maybe Britain's Vietnam. And they reminded us that the British had a very hard time winning hearts if they were fighting their own countrymen. They pointed out to us that instead of celebrating Lafayette as much as we do, perhaps we should raise the glass more often to de Grasse, and I would add Vergennes. I love the focus on Washington, and we'll come to more of that in a moment when we get to Ed Lengel and the panels this afternoon, but clearly they were all of a mind that he held a ragtag army together and essentially held a very weak nation together. We lost 1% of the population in the American Revolution, something unprecedented in our history before or since, except for the Civil War. And it was the longest war in America, except for Vietnam. Gordon Wood left as his parting important messages, reminding us that this was part of a global war. And he reminded us of the extent of the hardship and sacrifice, and reminded us most of all that what the revolution resulted in was a mission statement for a country born of ideas that still bonds us today. Andrew reminded us that it was a civil war, that the Loyalists were not united. And as he had done earlier in the morning, gave us a fantastic portrait of the competency of the British military and overturned the myth and the caricatures of them as weak and incompetent leaders. And in fact, he's mixed the argument quite clearly. These are the greatest minds of the British military. It was simply the mistake that they overestimated the Loyalists and didn't send an occupational army, nor could they have afforded it. In the afternoon, when we really explored land and sea, Ed Lengel reminded us of the myths about George Washington and helped us understand all the more clearly Washington's devoted recognition that the imperative was to preserve hope for the future, not to win at all costs. There were seething and conflicting motivations that the Americans were dealing with on the part of the foreign powers. Witness George Washington's decision not to get the French help and go into Canada. And I loved his phrase, human contingency was never more important than in the land campaign of the American Revolution and in the single figure of George Washington. Jonathan Dull walked us through why the French Navy was so successful when it had not heretofore necessarily been such, and really helped us understand the importance of the resources and the king's support. He also reminded us that the French victory at Yorktown was not only a miracle for us, but it was a miracle that saved the French from catastrophe, and gave us that wonderful word characterizing the French Navy, audacity, something that did not, in fact, describe the French army. And he finally left us with the thought that Rochambeau was one of the greatest generals of the 18th century. And then in the panel discussion that followed, we had that arresting moment when we learned that Rochambeau and Washington couldn't speak together. And it was actually the Marquis de Chastellux who created the communications between them to such good effect. As we turn to negotiating the Treaty of Paris, we learned that 1783 was a year of miracles. Not simply because of the American treaty, but it was that arresting moment in global history when George Washington resigned and gave up power that most thought he would not. And then, in a wonderful way, Doug Bradburn compared the puny provincial, those are his words, new United States to the success of balloon flight. What a wonderful metaphor. Something as fragile as a balloon going up and creating really the beginning of an aerospace industry compared in that same year to what happened, the Treaty of Paris. I had no idea that the American negotiators were breaking so readily their promises to both French and to Congress, and that Franklin was actually, of course, the most brilliant negotiator of all, negotiating the payment of the debt without sacrificing our autonomy. David Hancock gave us an extraordinary portrait of the Earl of Shelburne, a man who many would compare to some of our greatest Enlightenment minds, one of the top 10 aristocrats, a military man, a politician, an intellectual, a Francophile, a cosmopolitan who saw as the end goal for the Treaty of Paris not just British interests, but amity and balance. Those were the watchwords of his negotiations. And while he was criticized for being weak, his focus on compromise and his focus on European balance, his respect for moderation and justice, and his desire to limit the expansion of Russia and Prussia were huge factors in why the Treaty of Paris turned out the way it did and why America was the greatest beneficiary. One might say that it was Vergennes and Shelburne both believed that they could effect peace, long-term peace in Europe, with the primacy of Europe in their sights. Michael Pillsbury did a phenomenal job of taking those foundational lessons and bringing them forward into warfare, intelligence, and diplomacy today. And I loved his description of George Washington as the founder of Foreign Intelligence Collection, John Jay as the founder of Counterintelligence, and Franklin as the founder of Covert Action, the co-mastermind with Shelburne of the Treaty of Paris. So as I pull all of that together, I think it's maybe clear, perhaps, that France has played perhaps the strongest role of any nation in establishing America's independence and assuring our expansion as a world power. Let's not forget that closing window that resulted in the Louisiana Purchase. And so I will end with a quote from Thomas Jefferson that I hope maybe after today's proceedings, more of you may share Jefferson's sentiments. In 1821, in his draft autobiography, he wrote, "So ask the traveled inhabitant of any nation, in what country on earth would you rather live? Certainly my own, where all my friends, my relations, and the earliest and sweetest affections and recollections of my life. Which would be my second choice? France." Thank you.